So I've been around electric vehicles for 10 years plus. I buy into the idea it's good for the planet for us to move down that path. But here in Australia, the bug hasn't hit me yet. I've still got a lot of questions around the cost of vehicles, the infrastructure that exists, this idea of parking up your car, for half an hour to recharge your vehicle just doesn't sort of fit well with the idea of driving in, filling up your car with fuel and 5 minutes later being done with that task. So there's a whole bunch of things that sort of hold me back from making the investment, but I at some point would like to make that investment. So I'm really fascinated by the conversation with and with your combined experience. I'm sure we can cover a bit of ground today.
You're in an SUV. Do you plan to stay in an SUV, or are you looking at a different type of vehicle?
Probably stay in an SUV, a smaller one though. Doesn't need to be a big SUV. It can be a smaller one, but I sort of quite like that higher driving style. We've got a couple of dogs, so that's helpful to have that facility. So one would be an SUV and one could be, a regular sedan or hatchback or whatever it needs to be.
And as far as your lifestyle, do you travel long distances in your cars? Is that what it is? Or are you planning to travel long distances, or is it going to be mainly a metropolitan with maybe a 200 or 300 kilometre drive associated with it every now and then?
So historically, we haven't done a lot of driving. I think because of where we're at our stage of life, we are going to change that. We now have a property down on the peninsula. Now that's only 100 kilometres away, but there's a return trip there. Our daughter is based up in Bendigo now, so she's living up there. So that's a little bit further, and we would like to do some travel. For us, that sort of idea of how could we travel around Australia in an electric vehicle becomes an interesting conversation, and therefore perhaps one of the things that we will do is an electric vehicle on one side, and we'll keep a regular vehicle on the other side. But again, that will sort of come down to my questions and how that infrastructure is in place today.
How important is the environment to you as far as greenhouse gas emissions, and from a rating of 1 to 10, is it a 10? It's the ultimate in decision-making process, or is it a sort of blend halfway through?
I'd probably, I would say definitely we need to be doing the right thing by the world. This planet only has so much capacity. Do I live on the edge of my sort of green thinking? Probably not. I'd probably say I'm a 7 or an 8. I want to do the right thing, but I want it to work for me as much as for other things. So we're doing a renovation on a house. We'll put solar on that house. Solar on houses is not a new technology, but we will do that. But with a car, I think for me, I still have a lot of questions around that whole infrastructure side of things and the cost. So cost, as an example, I don't know whether I am green enough to say I would pay a premium for an electric car over a petrol car. Yet, I am certainly very conscious of doing the right thing by the planet, as I think, as I hope everybody is. Now, I recognise that sort of top end, there are people who want to go quickly and others who, don't want to go as quickly. I'd probably sit, somewhere at a 7 in terms of my commitment to it.
And another question around your purchase decision.
Yeah.
How do you, I'm keen to get an idea of what you value from a cost perspective. Is it the purchase price, or do you look at the whole of life cost? Would that be the sort of thing you'd be happy for an upfront heavier investment, but a better return over a longer period of time? Or how would you gauge what a value proposition would be from a purchasing perspective?
For me, the price obviously is important. I tend not to think about the cost of running a vehicle. I'm not that engaged in that sort of thinking. I buy a car, I run it, I buy a new car. So for me, I'm not, I don't look at the entire life cycle, if you like. The initial cost of a car is important to me, mainly from a sort of a value point of view. That upfront cost is important, but beyond that, I tend not to think about the running costs, because it's sort of, sometimes when you do think about it, for me, it sort of frightens me about how much money we pour into vehicles. So let me ask you a few questions then. So let's start with the cost. My perception, really, that would be from online advertising, because I haven't gone to any, car dealerships yet or car organizations to start researching cars. But my perception is an electric vehicle is quite expensive by comparison to today's cars. Is that a true statement, or have I got that wrong?
Take a small electric car. You're probably looking at around 22 to 24,000 for an internal combustion engine, but that same electric vehicle maybe be around 50,000. Now, on average, over 3 years of running the vehicle, you will save probably around $16,000 in terms of saving on fuel costs such as diesel or petrol, and then the servicing costs, because you don't need to service electric vehicles much as it. So if you add that 16,000 to the 22 or 24,000, you get to around 38, 40,000. So there's still around a $10,000 difference. But that's all averages. So if you travel a lot less, your saving will be less. And if you travel a lot more, your saving will be more. And that's where it comes in, if you don't have government intervention to narrow that $10,000 gap. The chasm is too big for people to jump. They just can't afford to spend that extra amount of money.
So, Mark, does that really go to your point that we need to think about the total cost of the car rather than just the upfront fee? Because then you can start to do some comparisons of what the real cost is.
When you purely look at purchase price right now, definitely, as per John what John's saying, the purchase price is significantly higher than, say, an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engines have become very efficient from a production perspective, from a consumption perspective, and a reliability perspective. Whereas EVs, it's a new technology. It's still, it's all about the battery. The battery is the expensive part. Electric motors have been around for a very long time, and there's obviously improvements that have been done along the way with the actual electric motors, and the drivetrains are very robust. And the drivability is very different to a internal combustion engine, because your torque curve is immediate. You've got maximum torque right from the word go, whereas with a internal combustion engine, you've got to build up to the torque curve, and the power curve is different to the torque curve. So depending on what you use it for, diesels are great with lots of torque down low. EVs will have even more torque down low, which there's a lot of misconceptions that an EV can't tow. Well, in fact, it's the opposite. They can tow very well. The challenges are around the things that John was talking about. So you're paying up a lot of upfront cost to purchase the technology, but running it and charging it, and especially if you're putting solar on your roof, it's actually cost neutral. If there is zero cost, you're actually filling up your vehicle with free energy that you're getting from the sun. So that's very cost effective. And this is the other bit that we now look at, and we've had a conversation with some car subscription organizations. Subscriptions are a way to get around this big purchase cost. So if you just want to have a car for so much per week or so much per month, the subscription model makes a lot of sense, and you can get into an EV without having to pay that $50,000, $60,000 premium for a small car that John's talking about. So you're looking at, well, what does that car cost me per month? And does that fit with my my budget? So you will be paying for some of the depreciation. And the biggest cost in owning any car is actually the depreciation cost. That's the number one. The mileage that John talks, or the kilometres that John talks of, the downside with EVs currently is that you're going to be recharging a lot to do those high Ks. So the range has been a problem in the early days of EV, but now that's well and truly getting within a very palatable number. Like 300-400 kilometres is actually quite mainstream now, whereas previously it was around about 100 to 150 Ks. Your trip down to the peninsula, well and truly covered there and back, and probably can do 2 trips there before you need to recharge. But when you drive down the peninsula, you park it up and you plug in like you do with your iPhone or your Android. You plug it in, you just charge it up, and it becomes second nature that you just pull into where your driveway is, plug in. Now, a lot of people talk about, well, but I live in an apartment, I have on-street parking. Well, they've actually had on-street parking in Europe for quite a long time. In fact, not many people have garages. If you look at the EV take-up in say, France. Yeah. And the Europeans have been very good in adopting with power poles, very small little like parking meters with cables, and just plug your cars in and away you go. So that can be overcome with investment. And that's the next thing that has to happen is further infrastructure investment to give you peace of mind to be able to charge up with these new technologies of fast chargers. The other thing, and we talk about the jumping the chasm, the early innovators and early adopters were quite happy to accept the slower charge rates by virtue of having an EV, because it looks different. The early EVs actually looked very different to the mainstream cars, so they stood out. And that's what the early innovators and adopters wanted. Yeah. Same as the Priuses looked different to other cars, because you want to make a statement that I'm actually doing something different. Yeah. But what you're seeing now is more of the EVs coming on board look very similar to the mainstream vehicles. Yeah. In fact, you mentioned the hybrids. So the best-selling cars in the electric space are actually petrol electric hybrids, which are the RAV4 has really done exceptionally well because it looks like a normal RAV. Yeah. And it's not that much more expensive than a straight-out internal combustion version. So there isn't that excessive premium. There is a slight premium, but it's a premium that narrows that chasm versus what the previous hybrids were. When we look at pure EVs, there's still a significant gap. And in Europe, the governments of the various countries there have actually provided support and incentives to bring that gap down so that the subscription models work or the leasing arrangements work, where you enter into a lease on the vehicle or even lease the battery separate to the vehicle. Yeah. Because the battery was always the most expensive part. Now, battery technology is getting better and better as each year passes. So, they're getting cheaper to make. And a lot of that's been driven out of China because they're getting better and better at producing batteries for vehicles. And they've invested heavily in EV technology. So that's coming down. The price of it's coming down. It's still a gap, but it's getting cheaper and the range is getting better. So it comes down to how do you finance it? The vehicles will go for very long periods of time because there's less moving parts and there's actually less servicing that needs to be done. So the average service on a diesel vehicle, once you get over the 60,000 Ks, is looking between $400 and $800 for a mainstream vehicle. If you're looking for a premium car, it's a lot more than that. So with EVs, you won't have any of that. You'll have very basic servicing for EVs. So the longer you keep them, the costs will actually be less. So, and that's why probably the financing model or the subscription model makes it more palatable to take on an EV.
In terms of some of the comments that you both made, so let's start with the distances of vehicles. I have in my head again, this is based on not a lot of research, that a vehicle could do 300 or 400 kilometres now. Is that a fair statement, or are we seeing that grow continually? What's sort of the distance on a single charge for a vehicle?
Steve, on average now, you're seeing vehicles they can do 400 kilometers. But it depends. There's a whole lot of factors that it depends on. It depends on how many passengers you have. If you're taking your son to footy and he's 6'4" and weighing 120 kgs and he's got his two mates who are the same size, that will impact your distance. If it's very hot or very cold, if you got the heater on or you got the air conditioning on, if you're driving up and down hills, those are all impacted. So if you add all those factors in, it could drop back to, say, 300 kilometers. If you're driving along a flat surface, there's no headwind, nothing's happening, you should be able to get to around the 400 kilometer mark.
And the other consideration that you get with the technology with an EV is when you're going downhill, the vehicle regenerates. So the electric motors actually pump energy back into the battery. So braking as well, it's regenerative braking. So that will put energy back into the battery. So slowing down charges it up, accelerating drains it. So there's this constant ebb and flow of energy between the electric motor and the battery to either extend the range or reduce it, depending with the variables that John mentioned. Another thing, though, that is a bonus with EVs, and John rightly points out that heating and cooling impacts the vehicle and the battery. But the beauty of EVs is that when they're plugged in and charging, you can actually set your temperature to what you want the car to be. So when you jump in the car and unplug it, that vehicle will be set to the temperature that you need. So you don't need to use, like it's not jumping on a hot day into a car and you need to fire up the air conditioner to bring the temperature down. It draws a lot of energy out of the engine to do so. With an EV, the air conditioner is conditioning that vehicle whilst it's on charge to mains power. So you've set it up so that it's not hot to start with or it's not cold to start with. It's only if you're in an environment where it needs to maintain that at a high level is where it will drain that energy.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about the charging element. So firstly, just simplistically, is all I need a 240 volt socket, or does the car plug into something that goes into the electricity? So what's the system that you would have in your apartment or your house? Let's imagine we're renovating this house. What am I going to build into my house? Do I need 3-phase electricity? What is it that the car connects to?
You can connect it to just a normal plug point, but your charging rate will be very slow. So it'll take you a lot longer. And it's also not good for the battery. So under emergency situations, so if you went down to your cottage and it was low on charge and you needed to charge it to get back to Melbourne, you could do that. But you need to actually put a proper socket in and have the proper cable between the vehicle and that socket to charge in the quickest way possible.
So therefore, I've got to have a special socket, a special electricity supply to the car. That's what we're saying. You can't just plug it into a straight 240 volt socket.
Well, you can plug into the 240, but it might take you 8 or 10 hours to charge. Whereas if you have the proper connection, it might take you an hour to charge.
So that's something for us to consider actually in our renovations. Because here's my dilemma. So we, as I said earlier, sold our family home. We've moved into an apartment closer to the city. We've got this place down on the peninsula, and we're now going to go between the two. That's sort of how life will be for us. Here in the apartment, because it's an older apartment building, I can't see us having access to a charging station in the basement of the building, not that I'm aware of. So therefore, I think my better charging option would be at the house down on the peninsula. Now, I recognise then there's this whole infrastructure where you can go and plug in. I don't think we're yet market in the street, are we? We don't have, you can't plug into lampposts and parking meter type things here in Australia.
There are some community charge points. A lot of local councils have them near their council facilities. And there are some other organisations that do have charge points in their car parks, in underground car parking, and some shopping centres are already setting them up as well. So it is starting to roll out, but not to the level that we see in Europe, where there are a multitude of power points in the streets with cables already attached to plug into vehicles. But they are starting to roll out.
This idea of I would go to a charging station and sit there for a period of time, half an hour, to recharge my car, I think is another, certainly inhibitor for me. I just can't get my head around the current model. And I know this is all a big change management exercise for all of us. I can't get my head around this idea of I would drive to a charging station and sit there for half an hour, whatever the number is, I don't know what it is, whilst I recharge my car. I can see it when I'm at home. I charge my car, and hopefully the number of times I would have to go to a charge station outside of that would be low. But is that the case? You have to sort of sit there for half an hour, I don't know what the numbers are.
In the short term, it'll be more difficult, especially if you can't get charging out in the street next to your apartment. But in the long term, I think most of your charging will be done at home, or when you go to the shopping centre to purchase groceries, or you could possibly charge there. So I think the availability of charging will happen, and it'll be only in emergency situations where you actually have to go and sit somewhere and wait half an hour while you do a charge. The challenge is going to be if you travel long distance, if you travel from Melbourne to Sydney, and you need to stop somewhere and charge on the way.
And that really goes to my point. So let's go to that one, which is, I choose to drive to Sydney, for example. I'm going to have to stop at least once, maybe twice. How long do I have to stop for the current charging technology?
It's about an hour. in terms to charge it to full capacity. But that's improving all the time. And I think you're going to get improvement going forward. So each year, the batteries are getting better, the charge is lasting longer, you're getting bigger distance.
Well, at the moment, we don't do a lot of that. As I say, we limit ourselves probably to 250 kilometers. As life changes, maybe that will change as well. But as you say, along the way, the distance you can travel on an electric vehicle will go up. The speed at which you recharge an electric vehicle will improve, and hopefully we'll have more charging stations in different locations. So you don't have to go to a shopping centre. You can just put it into a parking bay along the street somewhere and charge it up and go for a coffee.
The key very much is having a place to charge whilst you're sleeping. That's right. And that's interesting. You raise a very good point. If you don't have it in your apartment building, that's a potential barrier for you and your lifestyle, because otherwise you've got to go down the change management path of, well, I know I'm going to have to drive to this particular shopping centre to do my shopping and park in their designated charging bays because that's where I can charge up. But if I'm low on energy, I really have to make it a direct beeline for there. I can't deviate anywhere other than going there.
So let's talk about batteries. I do sort of wonder about this as we move to more people driving electric vehicles and batteries being the primary source of how that vehicle moves. What's going to happen to those batteries? And are we just creating a different challenge for the future, which is hundreds of thousands or millions of batteries that the world has got to deal with because we're shifting cars, and how green is that? So talk to me about battery technology in the context of how green is it?
I think that's probably something as consumers we probably need to call out, some sort of visibility on what is a solution for those batteries at end of life. And secondly, what is a solution if the vehicle ends up in a vehicle accident? Because there's a good chance the vehicle will be written off quite quickly if the battery is damaged, the vehicle, because of the battery makes such a big part of the cost of the vehicle. And what happens to those batteries? The other big challenge we have is what metals and components go into the building of the battery, because there's quite a bit of rare earth metals going into those batteries. And now you're starting to see companies mining seabeds and that to get those metals. So it's fine saying, okay, well, I'm driving an EV because it's green, it doesn't do any emissions. But if they're destroying the seabed to get the minerals to produce the batteries.
Well, I'm reminded, John, having been in tech all my life, this was a conversation that the tech industry had to have around printed circuit boards. We were out printing a lot of circuit boards in the early days of computers, and we were just throwing them onto a scrap heap. And so I guess it's probably in that same category that we have to work out, what do we do with this technology that. And how long does a battery last, just out of interest? I mean, are we changing batteries every year, or is there a particular lifespan to them? If I was to buy a car today, how long would I expect my battery to last?
Well, initially they weren't sure. They thought batteries would last between 6 and 8 years, but they're now finding the batteries are lasting far longer than they expected. I think it depends on where the vehicle's running, how it's running, how often it's being charged. So I think there's a lot of factors going into it. At the moment, the number of batteries coming back is relatively small. But if every vehicle becomes an EV vehicle, you're going to get millions of batteries coming back each year. And there's only so many houses where they could be utilized. And I don't think we have that as clear as we should have.
It's interesting, John, and Steve, you actually, when you started the discussion today, you're putting solar panels on your place.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges with that is that when you're not using it, that energy is going back into the grid, and you're not actually benefiting from it when you need it at night. So there is significant demand for home batteries. The more we go down this path of solar and being self-sufficient from a sun perspective with our energy, it's storing it on your property. And this is where having enough battery capacity is where there's going to be future demand. And there's a lot of hype around Tesla as a car company, but it's interesting. Tesla's play is more around the technology than the automobiles. So it's about the cars, the batteries, then the actual, this is an automobile and we're going to sell this much and make X amount out of the cars, because the organisation has not been profitable in its early iteration, yet its share price is many times that of Toyota, which is the most successful car company out there. And the other irony is Toyota aren't investing heavily in EV. They've got a hybrid and also they've got a hydrogen fuel cell play. So they've done very well out of the hybrid side of things, because all those concerns that you raise, range anxiety, charging and disruptions to your lifestyle, don't happen with a hybrid. They're slightly different, but you get the EV experience of acceleration, but you have that peace of mind that you've got fuel and you can go anywhere and you don't have the inconvenience of plugging in. Jumping the chasm into a full-blown EV introduces all these other challenges that you have to look at from how did you solve them in your specific instance. Now, the batteries will be good news for you with your solar panels. And you'll need a bank of them to to store that energy that those solar panels are going to collect for you. So, but you wouldn't do that straight away. So you'll need, there's benefits then. You can charge your car up for free, basically, which is going to be fantastic. But it's the other bits around, well, hang on, I've got these annoying inconveniences that have to fit in with your life. But if you're looking at it from a green perspective, there will be an aftermarket for those batteries, absolutely. There's one thing that the auto industry and the entrepreneurs in the aftermarket specifically, whether it be recycling copper out of electrical wires or out of copper out of radiators in the old days and the other bits and pieces, the recycling and the pursuit of the metals will ensure that there's enough demand that those batteries won't end up in landfill en masse.
Do you think our circumstances in Australia do create a different challenge for electric vehicle rollout and adoption? Do you think our sort of size, the way we live our lives, is different to, say, Europe?
Europeans wouldn't consider doing a super long trip from, say, Melbourne to Sydney. The perception is here in Australia, we do 1,000-kilometre drives every second day. The reality is we don't. And the majority of trips that we undertake are less than 50 Ks, and then we'll park up somewhere and then do another 50 Ks coming the other way. So even your trip to Bendigo and back, you could do that well and truly with an EV without a problem. So the psychology that we want to because we can, it's a bit like we buy these massive SUVs to go off-road because one day we dream of doing it, but the reality is we never do. We never do, but we can. And that's the thing. We want to know because we can.
Ready.
Correct. So the compelling answer to the question of why has to be therein. It's so good to drive. It is so quiet. It is so smooth. It has amazing technology in it. And it's environmentally friendly and it's cost effective in the long run.
I do have another question, actually. What happens if your car runs out of charge? Is the RACV and those types of organisations set up to come and rescue EV drivers who've run out of battery? And from that's the first part. Then the second part is what happens if you crash your EV? Companies, the body shops set up to repair EVs?
The RACV have systems and processes in place to deal with EVs. So they have their people are trained, and there'll be some solutions that they provide. In the mainstream, I dare say most would be skewed towards the towing side, but the RACV, we really need to. I can't speak on their behalf for the motoring clubs, but they do have solutions for EVs that run out of charge. You'd have to explore that further with the various motoring clubs, whether they do have boosted charges for a short period of time that can give you some sort of energy to move. I really don't have an answer for that one. The second one we talked about, crash. The industry is training already up their people. as far as what to do in a crash, isolating the batteries and making sure the appropriate safety processes are undertaken in repair shops. Yeah. And also first responders are trained. So to make sure that if they're cutting someone out of a vehicle, that and this is where even just identifying the vehicles with the number plates, that they're an EV, so that they don't just get the jaws of life and cut someone out and cut through a high amperage cable that causes all sorts of problems for everyone. Yeah. So that and also mindful of batteries with impacts that potentially could start fires, etc. So they're across all of that as well. So there's definitely enough time has gone through. The EVs are not new, and that's the beauty of it. They're not new, and the fact that it's a slow uptake has given the other organisations time to upskill and readiness for it. But there's still a long way to go. There's more organisations and other repair shops that need to get up to speed with it. But there is that. There very much is that readiness in sections of the aftermarket for repair. Sure, there are plenty of people in our circumstance thinking we would like to think about an EV. We agree that it's good for the planet, but there's a whole bunch of unknowns that prevent me from making that first step. I feel somewhat more compelled at this stage to think about a hybrid, to say our next investment will be a hybrid and maybe give EV a little while longer. At least that's a step in the right direction.